Hi guys and welcome to Crazy Pepper Revenge. This channel is all about crazy true stories, stuff that happens in real life when things get a little bit messy.
My wife Diane whispered sharply as we stepped out of the car at the Chicago fundraiser, "Stay behind me tonight. Don't embarrass me in front of these people." She said it like I was a child who might knock over expensive vases. I nodded because that's what I'd been doing for the better part of 3 decades. We'd driven up from Rockford that afternoon, and she'd reminded me no fewer than 4 times that this charity gala mattered critically for her career trajectory. The new CEO would be making an appearance. Important donors would be observing everything. Optics and perception mattered more than anything else. Inside the grand ballroom, everything smelled like expensive perfume mixed with furniture polish and something floral being pumped through the ventilation system. A jazz trio played softly near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. The lights from the water reflected through the glass like they'd been specifically designed as part of the elegant decorations. Diane moved ahead of me with her shoulders pulled back and her heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. She looked like she belonged in that world completely. I absolutely did not. My tuxedo was rented from a shop on the east side of town, and the collar scratched against my neck constantly. My hands were the real problem, though. Rough, calloused, and scarred from 35 years of electrical work in the field. Diane had noticed them in the restroom before we entered the ballroom, and had tried forcefully to make me cover the worst marks with some kind of beige concealer cream. "They look incredibly rough," she'd said quietly, like it was a shameful secret we both needed to keep hidden. I'd washed the stuff off in the sink and watched it swirl away down the drain like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter. When we entered the main ballroom area, Diane positioned me strategically behind her shoulder, close enough to fetch a drink if she snapped her fingers, far enough away to remain essentially unseen by anyone important. "Stay in the back," she hissed again as a cluster of well-dressed executives approached her. "Don't embarrass me." I stood next to a thick marble column and watched the crowd move and shift. I listened to Diane laugh at jokes she'd clearly heard before and talk about leadership principles and corporate culture and business ethics like she'd personally invented all 3 concepts. People nodded approvingly and glasses clinked together. Names floated past me that I didn't recognize from any context. Then the background music dipped noticeably, and a ripple of attention went through the entire room. Heads turned in unison. Phones disappeared into pockets and purses. The new CEO had arrived. Rebecca Morgan moved through the crowd like she didn't need anyone's permission or approval to exist in that space. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, wearing a deceptively simple black dress with her hair pulled back severely. No flashy jewelry worth noticing at first glance, which probably meant what she wore cost more than my truck. She shook hands efficiently as she walked, but her eyes were actively scanning and searching for something specific. Diane straightened her posture immediately, lifted her champagne glass with practiced grace, and stepped forward confidently with the smile I knew intimately well. Rebecca walked directly past her. She walked past the carefully prepared smile, past the rehearsed toast, past the anticipated introduction, moving straight toward me, standing awkwardly by the column. I felt it happening before I fully understood it, like when the air pressure changes dramatically before a major storm arrives. Rebecca's gaze locked directly onto mine and held firm. She closed the distance between us in 3 purposeful steps and reached out with both palms open. When she touched my hand gently, she paused noticeably. Her thumb brushed carefully over the scar on my wrist, the pale curved mark that looked like a question mark from a construction job that went dangerously wrong 2 decades ago. Then she said it quietly, but clearly enough for nearby people to hear. "I've been searching for you for 28 years. Behind her position, the room reacted immediately. A sharp, collective intake of breath, the thin, delicate chime of crystal striking stone floor. Glass shattered somewhere near my feet. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Diane's champagne flute. I looked directly at Rebecca and tried desperately to speak, but my throat completely closed up. All I could physically manage was, "I think you've got the wrong person here." She shook her head once, definitively. "No," she said with absolute certainty. "I don't." Diane pushed forward forcefully then, the color visibly draining from her face. "Rebecca, Ms. Morgan, this is my husband, Marcus. He's just a union electrician." Rebecca said it softly without breaking eye contact with me. "From Rockford. I know exactly who he is." Diane froze completely in place. I felt simultaneously small and enormous, seen clearly in a way I hadn't been in years, possibly decades. The background music picked back up awkwardly. Someone nearby laughed too loudly to break the tension. A waiter knelt down professionally to sweep up broken glass. Rebecca squeezed my hands one final time. "We'll talk soon," she said with gentle firmness. "Very soon." Then she disappeared back into the crowd like she'd never actually stopped moving through the room. Diane stared at me like I'd deliberately set the entire building on fire. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice tight and carefully controlled. "What did you say to her?" I shook my head slowly. "Nothing at all. She said it to me." Diane's jaw clenched visibly. She bent down to retrieve her purse from where she'd dropped it, then straightened up with all her professional composure firmly back in place. "Go get another drink," she said coldly, "and stay in the back where you belong." I did exactly what she asked, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. I could feel it physically in my chest, like a door that had been locked and sealed for years had finally cracked open slightly. I watched Rebecca from across the crowded room while Diane took the stage later and praised institutional integrity and visionary leadership. I watched wealthy donors lean in attentively to listen. I watched people glance curiously at me now, wondering. For the first time in a genuinely long time, I wondered if I'd been standing in the back because I naturally belonged there, or simply because someone had repeatedly told me to. I didn't know why Rebecca had been searching for me specifically. I didn't know what she knew about my past. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My life wasn't small and insignificant anymore. I couldn't sleep at all that night in the hotel. Diane lay rigidly beside me in the bed with her back turned completely, stiff as a board. The hotel room was eerily quiet except for the persistent hum of traffic along the street below and the occasional siren echoing off the river and buildings. I stared at the textured ceiling and replayed Rebecca's face over and over in my mind. How her eyes had gone straight to my scarred hands immediately, how certain and sure she'd sounded when she said my full name. 28 years of searching. By morning, Diane was already fully dressed and standing at the window with her phone pressed firmly to her ear, whispering sharp, clipped little sentences into it. When she finally noticed me awake and watching her, she deliberately turned her back. On the long drive home to Rockford, she didn't bring up the incident at all. Neither did I initially. The silence sat heavily between us like a third passenger, uncomfortable and oppressive. It broke completely 2 days later. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, staring blankly at the local newspaper without actually reading anything, when my phone buzzed loudly. Unknown number. Chicago area code displayed. "Marcus Keller?" a woman's voice asked when I answered cautiously. "Yes, this is Marcus." "This is Rebecca Morgan." I closed my eyes tightly and took a slow breath. We met at a small family diner just off the highway outside town, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a bell mounted on the door that still jingled cheerfully when you walked in. Rebecca was already there when I arrived, sitting with her back to the window and her hands folded carefully around a chipped ceramic mug. No personal assistant, no corporate entourage, just her alone. "You still drink it black," she observed as I slid cautiously into the booth across from her. "I never stopped," I said honestly. She smiled, the smallest subtle curve of her mouth, and for a brief second I saw her younger, wind whipping through her hair, laughing freely in the bleachers at a college baseball game with a cardboard tray of nachos precariously balanced on her knees. "You remember?" I asked, somewhat surprised. "I remember absolutely everything," she said quietly. "That's always been the problem." She told me she'd been back in town once, several years ago. She'd driven slowly past the old baseball field where we used to watch games together. The chain-link fence was badly rusted, and the outfield grass was patchy and unkempt, but she could still see it vividly. Me at the plate in 1995, bottom of the seventh inning, 2 outs remaining, the sharp crack of the bat, the way the entire crowd stood up simultaneously. "I told my college roommate I was going to marry you someday," she said, like she was discussing the weather forecast. I laughed, short and genuinely surprised. "I couldn't even afford a car back then." "You had something significantly better," she said. "You were steady and reliable and real." The memory hit me hard and unexpectedly. The smell of fresh-cut grass in summer, the taste of dust hanging in the air, my father's distinctive voice from the stands enthusiastically cheering me on. Before the cancer diagnosis, and before he got seriously sick. I told her why I'd left baseball completely, about attending the funeral, about the crushing medical bills that accumulated rapidly, about the factory job that eventually turned into a formal apprenticeship and ultimately a union card. I wrote you letters, she said very quietly. After I moved away for graduate school, I called your number repeatedly. I even asked around town about you. I never got anything from you, I said honestly. She nodded like she'd expected exactly that answer. I know you didn't. I didn't ask how she knew that fact. I was genuinely afraid of the answer. We talked for well over an hour, about Rockford changing and evolving, about work and careers, about time passing relentlessly. She didn't touch me again or flirt in any way. She just listened attentively. When we finally stood to leave, she slid a business card smoothly across the scratched table. If you ever need help understanding complicated paperwork or financial documents, she said carefully, call this number. It's not about money or charity. It's about clarity and truth. That night, Diane noticed the business card sitting on the kitchen counter. Who's Rebecca Morgan? She asked with forced casualness. Someone from my past, I said simply. She smiled without any genuine warmth in it whatsoever. Funny how the past shows up right when the future's on the line. I didn't respond to that comment. I went to bed thinking about letters that apparently never arrived and a completely different life that might have been possible. And then I thought about my retirement account because for the first time it occurred to me that I genuinely couldn't remember the last statement I'd actually seen with my own eyes. I wasn't actively looking for trouble. Trouble came looking directly for me in the form of a missing envelope. Every quarter, like reliable clockwork, there used to be a thick statement waiting in the mailbox when I got home from work. My 401k summary, the pension breakdown, boring administrative stuff, comforting stuff, concrete proof that 35 years of early mornings and dangerous live wires were slowly building into something solid and secure for the future. That envelope hadn't shown up in several months. At first, I told myself everything was digital now in the modern world. Diane had said that repeatedly more than once. Paperless is cleaner and more efficient, Marcus. But the nagging thought wouldn't let go of my mind. It sat persistently in the back of my consciousness while I tightened electrical connections and carefully labeled circuit breaker panels, while I drank terrible coffee at the break table with the other union guys, while I drove home past the old Union Hall building on the east side of town. That evening, Diane was on the phone when I walked in through the door. I know, she said, laughing softly into the receiver. He doesn't understand numbers or finances at all. I'll handle it completely. She turned her back deliberately when she saw me standing there in the doorway. Something in my chest went ice cold. Later that night, after she'd gone upstairs to bed, I opened the desk drawer where we kept tax returns and old warranties and important documents. The folders were there, organized neatly as always, but the blue 3-ring binder marked clearly as retirement was completely gone. I checked the filing cabinet in the hallway thoroughly. I checked the hall closet carefully. I checked the garage shelf where we kept old instruction manuals and random paperwork. Nothing anywhere. Diane, I called up the stairs. She came down slowly and very carefully. What? Where's the retirement binder? She frowned like I'd asked something completely silly. Why do you need that right now? I just want to look at it. She waved a hand dismissively. It's all online now. You don't need to worry about it anymore. I do, I said firmly. I've always looked at it every quarter. Her eyes hardened for just a split second before she smoothed them over professionally. Marcus, you're tired. You've been distracted since that gala. Let me handle this. That word again, handle. Like I was a problematic child to be managed. I didn't push the issue. I went to bed and stared at the ceiling the same way I had in that Chicago hotel room, listening to the house creak and settle around us in the darkness. The next morning on my lunch break, I stopped by the credit union. The woman at the counter knew me personally. We'd gone to the same high school, though she was a year behind me. She typed something into her computer, frowned noticeably, then looked up at me with concern. Your mailing address was changed in the system, she said. When exactly? About 6 months ago, according to this. To where? She hesitated uncomfortably. A P.O. box here in town. I felt my stomach drop sickeningly. Who authorized that change? She glanced at her computer screen. Your wife. Power of attorney is on file. I stared at her blankly. I never signed a power of attorney document. She bit her lip. It's on file here, Marcus. I drove back to the job site with my hands physically shaking on the steering wheel. Every red light felt significantly longer than the last one. Every turn felt fundamentally wrong somehow. That evening when I got home, I asked Diane to sit down at the kitchen table. I went to the credit union today, I said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes at all. Why would you do that? They said you changed the mailing address. They said you have power of attorney over my accounts. She sighed like I was a frustrating child who'd interrupted her during something important. It was just easier that way. You forget things constantly, Marcus. I don't forget my own name. Don't be dramatic about this. I asked to see the actual paperwork. She brought a folder from the kitchen drawer and slid it across the table toward me. It was thick with tabs and signatures and dates. My name was on several pages throughout. See, she said gently, you signed these yourself. I looked at the signatures carefully. They were mine, or close enough to pass casual inspection. I remembered a day several months earlier when she'd handed me a stack of forms after dinner. She'd said they were routine updates for insurance and benefits. I'd signed where she pointed without reading carefully through everything. You said this was routine, I said. It was, she replied. You're reading too much into it. I flipped through the pages. Beneficiary changes, digital delivery authorizations. A spousal consent form I didn't remember discussing at all. My head started to pound. Marcus, she said, lowering her voice. You're getting confused. That happens sometimes at our age. That word, confused. It landed harder than anything else she'd said. I pushed the folder back across the table. I need some time to think about this. She nodded, already standing up from her chair. Of course. Just trust me. That night, I called the number on Rebecca's business card. The forensic accountant she'd recommended met me at a diner near the old shopping mall 2 days later. He brought a legal pad, and we sat across from each other with a pot of burnt coffee on the table between us. He spoke plainly and directly, explained how accounts could be redirected and how paperless delivery worked, how easy it was to move money and change beneficiaries without raising alarms if one spouse controlled the complete flow of information. You're not crazy, he told me firmly, and you're not alone. This happens more often than people think. On the drive home, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I thought about the way Diane had laughed on the phone, about how she'd told people I didn't understand numbers, about how small she'd made me feel for years without me even noticing it was happening. I could have exploded right then. I could have driven home and shouted and thrown that folder across the room and demanded answers. Instead, I did something my father had taught me after I'd struck out in anger during a crucial game back in '95. I slowed down. I took my time. I wrote everything down carefully. Dates, conversations, changes I could remember, and for the first time in longer than I could recall, I didn't stand in the back and wait for permission. Diane got significantly smarter the moment she realized I'd gotten curious. It wasn't a confession or a screaming match. It was subtler than that, like a skilled thief who doesn't trip the alarm but just changes the security code and smiles while you struggle with the lock. 2 days after I'd asked about the credit union, I came home from work and found the desk drawers reorganized completely. Not messy, worse. Neat and empty of anything useful. The filing cabinet in the hallway had a new lock on it, the cheap silver kind you buy at any hardware store. What's that? I asked, pointing at it. Diane didn't look up from her laptop. Privacy. It's my stuff too. She clicked her mouse like she hadn't heard me say anything. Your stuff is in the garage. I went to the garage and opened the old plastic storage tote where we kept manuals and warranties. Inside were light bulbs, duct tape, a bag of Christmas ornaments, and a laminated church directory from 2012. No retirement binder. That night she sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine like everything was perfectly normal. Marcus, she said without looking up, I talked to someone in HR legal today. My stomach tightened. About what? About you, she said, finally meeting my eyes. You've been acting strange since that gala. I let that sit for a second, amazed at the audacity of it, the way she could twist reality until I became the problem. I asked where our retirement statements went, I said, and you answered, paperless, cleaner, less clutter. I'm not clutter, I said quietly. She set the magazine down with exaggerated care. Do you want to keep your health coverage, Marcus? I blinked. What are you talking about? She gave me that HR smile, soft on the outside, but iron underneath. You've been working part-time lately. You've had those headaches. If you're going to start accusing me of things, it's going to create instability. I repeated the word slowly. Instability. It's just reality. She said, at our age, we can't afford mistakes. You don't understand how these benefits work. There it was again. That line she'd been using like a hammer for months. You don't understand. I wanted to shout at her. I wanted to tell her I'd wired half the industrial buildings on the south end of town and never once failed to understand the difference between a hot wire and a neutral wire. But this wasn't about electrical work. This was personal. This was someone trying to make me doubt my own mind, my own memories, my own worth. So I did the one thing she didn't expect. I nodded. Okay, I said quietly. Show me then. Her eyes narrowed. Show you what? The accounts, I said. Log in right now. Show me everything. She hesitated just long enough to tell me she wasn't used to being challenged like this. Then she picked up her laptop and turned it toward me, her fingers flying across the keyboard. You'll just get overwhelmed, she said as she typed. I'll try, I said. She logged in quickly like a magician performing a well-practiced trick. The screen flashed. Numbers appeared briefly. She scrolled fast, too fast for me to actually read anything, then snapped the laptop shut. See? She said. Everything's fine. That's not showing me, I said calmly. It is, she snapped, then caught herself and softened her tone. Marcus, you're not thinking clearly right now. I stared at her, at the woman I'd defended at funerals and holiday gatherings and school meetings over the years. The woman who used to lean her head on my shoulder at the drive-in movie theater back when we still laughed together. I'm thinking clearer than I have in years, I said. I walked upstairs and shut the bedroom door behind me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from the effort of holding myself back from saying like everything I wanted to say. The next day after work, I went to the Rockford Public Library. That would have sounded ridiculous to my younger self. Me, the guy who'd rather rebuild a car engine than reset a computer password, sitting at a public computer terminal with reading glasses perched on my nose, like I'd suddenly become my father. But I did it. I pulled out my phone and called the forensic accountant again. Okay, I said when he answered. Talk to me like I'm 5 years old. He chuckled. That's half my job, Marcus. He walked me through it slowly and patiently. Email recovery, security questions, two-factor authentication. I fumbled through the library keyboard like it was covered in grease. My fingers kept hitting the wrong keys. I muttered under my breath and got a disapproving look from a teenage librarian like I'd personally insulted her. After 40 minutes of frustration, I finally got into an old email account Diane didn't know I still had access to. One I'd used years ago when the union apprenticeship program required us to complete online training modules. And there it was, sitting in the inbox like evidence, notifications, account changes, address updates, a confirmation of a beneficiary update that I'd never actually seen because it had been sent to the new paperless system Diane controlled. My throat went dry. I printed everything, one page at a time. The library printer squealed and complained like it hated me personally, but it spit out proof. Black and white documentation of everything she'd done. On the way out of the library, I stopped at the diner on the east side of town and met with the attorney Rebecca had recommended. He was in his 60s, wore a plain suit, and talked like someone who'd spent decades watching people lie under oath. You don't need to be loud about this, he told me, tapping the stack of papers I'd printed. You just need to be precise, document everything, follow the proper channels. I'm not trying to ruin her, I said. He looked up at me. Then you're already ahead of her morally. That weekend, Diane hosted a donor brunch at our house. She didn't ask me if it was okay. She informed me it was happening. Just stay upstairs, as she said, while arranging flowers in a vase like she was preparing for a magazine photo shoot. We're discussing leadership initiatives. I almost laughed. Leadership? In my own house. While I was banished upstairs like an embarrassment. I had planned to avoid the whole thing, to keep collecting proof quietly and methodically. But then I heard one of the donor wives in the entryway say something that made me stop. Diane, your house is so curated, like a museum. Curated, like I was a dusty exhibit tucked away in the back room where visitors didn't go. Something in me snapped. Not into rage, but into resolve. I came down the stairs, not in a rented tuxedo this time. In my work boots, my worn jeans, a plain button-down shirt I'd ironed myself. Diane's eyes went wide like I'd walked in completely undressed. "Marcus," she hissed through barely moving teeth. "What are you doing?" "Living here," I said simply. A couple of people turned to look. One of the donors, a gray-haired man in a blazer, looked down at my boots and smiled like he approved of something. "Those Red Wings?" he asked, pointing. "Yeah," I said. He nodded with appreciation. "Good boots. My father wore those his whole life." Diane's smile froze in place for just a second. I wasn't invisible anymore. That night after everyone had left, Diane cornered me in the kitchen. "You embarrassed me," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. I leaned against the counter and looked at her calmly. "You've been embarrassing me for years, Diane." Her face flushed red. "You think you're clever now because some billionaire talked to you at a gala?" I didn't answer that. I didn't give her anything she could twist around or use against me later. Instead, I went to the garage and opened a cardboard box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old baseball clippings, a faded team photo from college, and a cassette tape labeled in Rebecca's handwriting from summer '95. I sat on the workbench and held that tape for a long time. Not because I wanted to run back to the past or pretend I was young again. Because it reminded me that I used to be someone who stood in the batter's box and didn't flinch when the pitch came hard and fast. The next morning, I got a text message from Rebecca. No hearts or sweet talk. Just a time and a place. A coffee shop near downtown Rockford. Quiet and neutral territory. When we met, she looked tired in a way that money couldn't fix. "I didn't grow up like this," she said, glancing around the coffee shop like she still couldn't quite believe she owned companies now and had power. "My first apartment had a leaky ceiling. I learned to keep every receipt because nobody else was going to keep me safe." She slid a folder across the table toward me. It wasn't cash or a check. It was access to information. Copies of corporate policies. An outline of proper compliance procedures, the correct channels to submit evidence without getting crushed by Diane's HR connections and friends. "Your story needs daylight," she said firmly. "Not drama, daylight." I swallowed hard. "She's going to come after me." Rebecca nodded once. "Then we do this right. Buy the book. Every step documented." I walked out of that coffee shop with the folder tucked under my arm, feeling its weight like a tool belt. Diane thought she'd locked me out by changing passwords and hiding documents. She hadn't realized I'd learned how to read the wiring behind the wall, how to trace circuits back to their source. And when the invitation arrived in our mailbox a week later, an engraved card for the Ethics and Leadership Awards dinner with Diane's name printed in gold script, I held it in my hands and felt something close to pity. Because she was building her entire life and reputation on image and perception, and I was quietly holding the documentation that could bring it down. Properly. Legally. One careful step at a time. The ballroom was louder this time. Not with music, but with voices. Low, overlapping, confident voices that belonged to people who thought they were safe and untouchable. The Ethics and Leadership Awards dinner was held at a hotel near the river. All glass walls and brushed steel fixtures. The kind of place designed to make you feel important just by walking through the doors. Diane had planned every detail down to the minute. She'd arrived early with a clipboard in hand and her heels clicking like a metronome. She hugged donors, laughed at inside jokes, kissed cheeks. Her name was printed on banners beside words like integrity, transparency, and corporate values. The irony was almost painful. I came in 10 minutes late. Not because I was nervous, but because timing matters. I wore a dark jacket and clean boots. Not flashy or defiant. Just me, being myself. I nodded at the valet, thanked the hostess, and took a seat near the back of the room where Diane had always preferred me. From my vantage point, she looked radiant on the stage, confident, untouchable. When she started her speech, the whole room went quiet to listen. "At a time when trust in institutions is fragile," she said into the microphone with perfect diction, "it's our responsibility as leaders to uphold ethical standards, even when it's uncomfortable." I felt a strange calm wash over me because I knew what was already in motion. 3 days earlier, the documentation packets had gone out through the proper channels, complete with timestamps and delivery receipts. The audit committee. outside legal counsel, the board liaison. Rebecca had quietly introduced me to the right people, the ones who cared about facts more than politics. Nothing had leaked to the press, nothing sensational or dramatic, just facts presented clearly. Expense reimbursements that didn't align with company policy. Conflict of interest, disclosures that were incomplete or misleading. HR emails documenting pressure on employee spouses to sign documents presented as routine. Beneficiary changes made without proper informed consent. Small violations that added up. Paper cuts that bled when you put them all together. From the corner of my eye, I saw a man in a gray suit lean over and whisper something to a woman at the head table. She pulled out her phone and frowned. Another phone came out at a different table. Then another. Diane kept talking, but her voice wavered just slightly. Because dignity in the workplace isn't just a slogan or a poster on the wall. A hand went up near the front of the room. Diane, a board member said, standing up from his seat, "May we pause for a moment?" The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat nervously. Diane smiled, but it was tight and forced. Of course. He didn't sit back down. "There are some questions," he said carefully, choosing his words, "that need to be addressed before we continue with this program." Her eyes scanned the room frantically, searching for help, for control, for an ally. They found me instead. I didn't smile at her. I didn't nod or gesture. I just stood up from my seat. The sound traveled through the quiet room. Fabric against a chair, the scrape of boots on carpet. Heads turned to look. "Who is that?" someone whispered nearby. Diane's face went pale. "This is highly inappropriate," she said into the microphone, her voice suddenly sharp and defensive. "This is my husband. He's confused." There it was. That word one more time. I walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet from the edge of the stage. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but my hands were steady, steadier than they'd been in years. "I'm not confused," I said clearly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm informed." A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. The board member who'd stood up nodded once in my direction. "Mr. Keller has provided substantial documentation," he said to the room. "Very substantial documentation regarding financial irregularities and policy violations." Diane laughed, but it was a brittle sound that cracked in the air. "This is a personal matter," she said desperately. "A marital dispute being aired publicly." "No," the board member said firmly. "It's a compliance issue that affects this organization." The projector screen behind her flickered to life. Email headers appeared. Dates, policy excerpts, evidence laid out in careful order. Diane turned around and stared at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth, her lips parting but no sound coming out. She reached for the lectern, like it might hold her upright. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "This is all being taken out of context." I took one more step forward. "I've been standing in the back long enough to see everything clearly, Diane." Silence fell hard and heavy over the entire room. She looked at me then, not with anger, not even with fear, but with something close to disbelief, like she'd built her entire world on the assumption that I would never stand up, never question, never push back. Her hand shook. The glass of water on the lectern tipped over, rolled, and shattered on the stage floor. Nobody moved to help her. The board member thanked everyone for their patience and announced that the program would be temporarily suspended pending an internal review. Donors started avoiding eye contact with Diane. A few people glanced at me with something that looked like respect, curiosity. Diane was escorted off the stage by a member of the board. Her heels clicked out of rhythm for the first time I'd ever heard, uneven and uncertain. I didn't follow her. I stayed exactly where I was until the room began to buzz again with a different kind of energy. Questions. Real ones this time. When I finally stepped outside into the night air, it felt cool and clean in my lungs. I stood by the river and just breathed. Rebecca joined me a moment later. She didn't touch me or say anything profound. "You did it," she said simply. "We did it right," I replied. She nodded. Inside that ballroom, the dominoes were still falling in careful sequence. But out there under the city lights reflecting off the water, I felt something I hadn't felt since that summer in 1995. Solid ground under my feet. I moved out the following week. Not in a rush or in the middle of the night like I was fleeing. I packed what was actually mine, tools and clothes and a box of old photographs and that cassette tape from '95. I left the rest exactly where it was and let the house look curated without me in it. The attorney handled the legal proceedings because we had the paper trail, because everything had been done quietly and correctly through proper channels. The divorce didn't turn into a media circus or a public spectacle. The beneficiary changes were reversed by the financial institutions. The retirement accounts were corrected and returned to my control. The fraudulent power of attorney was voided. It wasn't a lottery jackpot or a revenge windfall, it was fairness. And after years of being told I didn't understand numbers or money or complicated adult matters, fairness felt like winning. Diane lost her job before the internal investigation even finished. HR directors don't survive public ethics violations, especially ones that make it into board minutes and legal filings. I heard through people around town, because in Rockford you always hear these things eventually, that she was exploring new opportunities. That was the corporate phrase she'd always liked to use when other people got fired. I didn't gloat about it. I didn't call her or drive past her new apartment or ask mutual acquaintances how she was doing. I didn't go looking for updates. I learned something important through all of this. Revenge, when it's done right, isn't loud or dramatic or satisfying in the moment. It's quiet and final and complete. The quiet days after everything settled were harder than I expected in many ways. There were mornings I woke up alone in a small apartment off the east side of town and felt the weight of 30 years settle heavy in my chest. 3 decades is a long time to realize you've been making yourself smaller, dimmer, less significant. Some nights I lay awake staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, wondering how I'd missed the signs for so long, how I'd let it happen. But then there were other moments that felt different, better. Like the first time I checked my financial accounts on my own computer and understood every single line item without anyone explaining it to me like I was stupid. Or the afternoon I stopped by the old baseball field on Boylan and watched a high school game from the bleachers. And the crack of the bat still sounded exactly the same as it had 30 years ago. Or the day I met Rebecca for coffee again at that same diner outside town. No gala this time. No speeches or awards or donors watching. Just a quiet place with chipped mugs and mediocre pastries and weak coffee. We talked slowly and carefully about where we were now in our lives, not where we'd been 3 decades ago. We didn't pretend we were 25 again with our whole lives ahead of us. We didn't rush into anything or make promises we couldn't keep. At our age, you don't chase fireworks and grand romantic gestures, you look for steady light that doesn't burn out. Sometimes we drove around with the radio on low, classic rock slipping through the speakers of her old SUV. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence and didn't talk at all. That was enough. More than enough, actually. I thought a lot about dignity in those weeks and months after everything changed. About how easy it is to give dignity away one small compromise at a time. One moment of backing down, one instance of staying quiet when you should speak up. About how standing in the back of the room becomes a habit if you're not careful, until you forget you're even capable of standing anywhere else. At 57 years old, I wasn't starting my life over from scratch. I was taking myself back, reclaiming the person I'd been before I'd learned to make myself invisible for someone else's comfort. If this story resonates with you at all, if you've ever felt invisible or underestimated or quietly pushed aside by someone who claimed to love you, take a moment to sit with that feeling. Remember that you're worth more than being someone's convenient background decoration. Some people spend their whole lives trying to impress a room full of strangers who don't actually care about them. Others finally remember who they are and step forward into the light where they belong. I chose to step forward after too many years in the shadows, and I'm never standing in the back again unless I choose to be there.